In the coming months, there'll be increasing tension between the economic needs of trade union members and the austerity strategy of the new Labour government. It'll be the pressure of those ordinary union members that force their leaders, some of them reluctantly, into opposing the austerity regime being cooked up by Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves. The annual Congress of the TUC this week shows only the beginning of a process of change that will affect the unions, with opposition to the government already starting to surface, despite the best efforts of the right-wing leaders of the big unions. The anger towards the government is already focused on the extremely unpopular decision to cut the winter fuel allowance to millions of pensioners. This is being opposed as much for what the policy implies, that ordinary working-class households will be expected to pay for the failures of the economic system. Lots of unions represent low-paid workers, said the General Secretary of the PCS union. He added, "I can see a situation where, if they continue along the line that they're heading with, not just with winter fuel payments, but with social security and benefits more generally, there'll be a real backlash. That could take the form of industrial action because lots of unions represent low-paid workers." Sharon Graham, Unite's General Secretary, suggested that last month's riots were a warning. If you abandon working-class communities, you create an open wound of discontent that the scapegoaters will stick their fingers in. This is how support for right-wing nationalism grows. Where it affects the direct interests of the trade unions, on the important issue of trade union rights, right-wing union leaders are expecting some quid pro quo for their support of Starmer up until now. Union leaders are not going to let Labour forget their commitment to a New Deal on workers' rights. Motions at the TUC Congress will call for the repeal of the 2016 Trade Union Act, removing the ballot threshold required for industrial action, including the additional 40% threshold applied to certain public sector workers and the 6-month limit for industrial action mandates. Congress will also call for the repeal of the Minimum Service Levels Act, the outlawing of zero-hours contracts, and a strengthened role for unions in collective bargaining, including giving all workers full employment rights from day one of employment. Unite specifically calls for a complete ban on fire and rehire and the removal of loopholes implicit in Labour's suggested New Deal. Even USDOR, generally a union on the right of the movement, calls for the full removal of all anti-trade union legislation. USDOR representatives on Labour's NEC will be expected to fight the same fight. We can expect an overwhelming, if not unanimous, passage of a motion on a New Deal for workers as an indication of what the union tops expect from their new government. When it comes to economic policy, most TUC conference motions are relatively muted in their demands, and it seems many trade union leaders are planning for the minimum amount of boat rocking. Only Unite puts forward specific policy goals, including a wealth tax on the richest 1% to raise $25 billion per year to our public services and NHS. But even Unite, a supposedly left-wing union, fails to grasp the nettle on the regeneration of national infrastructure by limiting itself to call for responsible borrowing to close the gap on public investment. Like the Labour leadership, the horizons of this union seem limited to what is possible under capitalism. Sharon Graham has called for Labour to tax the rich to pay for improvements in the NHS. Even where some unions have in the past called for renationalising their own sectors, they're now tamely letting Labour ministers off the hook by posing renationalisation as an aspiration rather than a firm policy. The CWU, for example, refers to the renationalisation of the postal service as a long-term goal, and the rail union ASLEF calls only for the expansion of publicly owned rail services, eventually resulting in a fully nationalised service. Unions have backtracked on nationalisation. This is a sharp move backwards from previous support by unions for the public ownership of utilities like rail, post, water and electricity, which were publicly owned in the past but have been plundered by privatisation. We should not forget that had it not been for the support of the right-wing leaders of Labour-affiliated unions, Keir Starmer would have not been able to ditch every single one of the 10 pledges he made when he stood for leader in 2020 and subsequently abandoned all the radicalism of the 2017 and 2019 Labour manifestos. The tops of Unison, Usdaw, and the GMB, who wield significant influence on Labour's NEC and at TUC, allowed the Starmer/Evans faction to ride roughshod over Labour Party rules and selection procedures. Now, the huge parliamentary Labour Party is packed with right-wingers and careerists. These trade union leaders bear some responsibility for Labour's right-wing drive towards a new round of austerity. So, despite the wishes of some right-wing union leaders, the issue of the winter fuel payments has become the key focus of opposition to Labour austerity at the TUC. A resolution from Usdaw calls for the scrapping of the 5-week wait for universal credit and the 2-child limit on benefits, while PCS call for opposition to cut the winter fuel allowance and demands appropriate taxation of corporations and the super rich to fund the social security improvements identified in this motion. Any warnings from the TUC on welfare payments will fall on deaf ears in Westminster. Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves have made it clear that living standards are bound to fall. Things are going to get worse, Starmer has said, and he is preparing for the government to be unpopular. One should expect under these circumstances, where each Labour minister's speech is more dire than the last, that the TUC leadership would sound the alarm loud and clear. Every union leader, not just one or two, should be warning the government that they will fight to defend the interests of workers. Instead, with a few notable exceptions, we hear muted warnings and resolutions listing lukewarm hopes and aspirations. Nevertheless, in the coming 6 months, all the trade union tops will feel the heat from their members, transmitted through national executive bodies, meetings of activists, and even full-time officers. As the threats of austerity grow louder, so too will the anger of trade union members. Thank you very much for watching. We hope you enjoyed the video. Please read the full article in the description below. Subscribe to our newsletter at www.lefthorizons.com. Subscribe to our channel if you like. Thank you very much for watching. Subscribe to the channel, and we shall see you next time.